Hey everyone, welcome to the Mind of Miz Podcast. We just got done recording our third episode for the Bill of Rights, and I didn't get through the whole thing, which is normally what I tend to do. So we'll probably be finishing our thoughts on that next week. But if you're interested in what we're talking about today, we try to dive into this particular question. Why is freedom of the press essential to political liberty? Why is that important? We want to dig into that. And so we do that here a bit. We look into what the media is. What does it mean? What is the mass audience of the media? We talk about what the press actually means. We have a definition for that so that you know what we're talking about here. We talk about the responsibilities of the press a little bit. We also go into talking about the responsibility of the audience just a little bit on that. So if you're interested in learning about any of these things, I would ask that you stay for the next hour or so. And if you do enjoy it, just make sure that you subscribe. Thanks. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mind of Miz Podcast. I'm your host, Ms. Rivera. Very happy to be here and continue on talking about the Bill of Rights here today. I want to start just kind of talking to you like if we're just going back and forth, I guess, in a discussion, because when I started looking into the topic that we're going to look at today, which is the press. So we're looking at the First Amendment and we're just focusing on the press. What is the press? And it almost felt like trying to hug a tree, like a big, enormous, one of those sequoia trees or something like that, because it's hard to think back to what the press is, what media is, what we term today as mainstream media and all these things. And so I wanted to take a chance to just talk about it, not so much from a, hey, here's everything that I know about it, because I'm still learning, but from a perspective of like, well, let's try and see how we can talk about these things. And so the first thing that I want to say is if you're being a part of this series, then you know that part of what we're trying to do with the Bill of Rights is trying to understand our American rights from a biblical perspective. So a biblical understanding of our American rights. It is part of what we're trying to do. And one of the difficulties with that is trying to not confuse the Bible and what the Bible teaches with what men have written in a constitution and a Bill of Rights or in any document that's been crafted by human hands. And some would argue, well, the Bible has been crafted by human hands. And my position on that, of course, is that the Bible is the inspired word of God. And while it was written by men, they were men that were inspired and carried along by the Holy Spirit. And so the author, essentially, of the Bible is God, the writers, the instruments being the men that God used. Well, there's this distinction that we have to make when it comes to how we think about our American government, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, without diving into a fringe or a extreme view of Christianity. Because the broad idea of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, which we're going to be talking about here today, and they really do go hand in hand, is not utopian in nature. Okay. The idea itself, even when you read it in the Constitution, when you read what the framers had to say about it, not that I've read everything, but I've read some of what they've had to say. When you read what other writers have said on this topic, what you find is that there's nuances and in the subject of freedom of press, freedom of speech, and all of these things. Certainly, the idea is not a free for all, meaning anarchy, meaning no law whatsoever. But but there is a certain pursuit of happiness that the Constitution talks about. The Declaration of Independence points us in that direction by saying, hey, this is what really we're going for. And when you tease that out, it's really trying to live the best life that you can as a citizen of a country, let's say. And so when we try to put the Bible into these things and hammer it in places where the Bible is somewhat silent, for example, like freedom of the press, let's say there's no verse that we can go to in the Bible that is going to tell us, hey, this is what freedom of the press is. And we try to put that into this space and force it, then you start going into a kind of utopian vision of what you would like the world to look like if everyone could just be a Christian. And I think we have to be careful with that, because part of what freedom of speech does, particularly for the Christian, it allows us through a medium like this here, this podcast. I think we're streaming on 4 different platforms right now that we're live on. And across these platforms, we're able to talk to you about our views about God, about what the Bible has to say regarding the things that we believe, the things that we proclaim in our Constitution, let's say. And so I think it's important that we never devolve into a point where we're just trying to tell the world that what we believe in here is 100% biblical. I think we have to be very careful with that. The Bible, again, doesn't comment on these things, and most of the world really lived in a world of censorship, in a world where you did not have the freedom of speech, and often your freedom of your speech was, compelled. In Rome, for example, we have the understanding there that you had to essentially tell people, use your words, let's say your speech, to declare your allegiance to Caesar. And this was something that was tough for Christians in the beginning. Some of them didn't do that, and they died for it. Others were doing it because they were afraid of being killed. And so I can imagine, just the terror that must have been to live under that. And so there was censorship there. But when the word of God and God himself is never going to get stopped, whether it's freedom of speech or censorship, he works in both avenues. God can use both things. And so we don't want to come across as making an argument necessarily that everything that's in the Bill of Rights is biblical and that the Bible makes an argument for these things per se. But what we do want to do is try to look at things as Christians. And as Christians, we should have a biblical worldview of things. And so everything is colored, you can say, with our biblical worldview. Some folks will have issues with that because they think that, well, there you go, your religion tells you how you should look at the world. But the thing is, we talked about belief last week. Everyone has their belief system. You have to believe in something. And of course, there are atheists out there and people that consider themselves to be agnostic and this kind of thing. And they're going to swear up and down to you that they don't believe in anything. But the truth of the matter is that even through censorship, one of the things that we're told in the Word of God is that we proclaim the truth. We proclaim what the Bible says. And we do that whether we live in a society that allows us the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, or whether it censors us. Now, with that being the case, what we don't want to do is become the kind of people that say, well, then I am going to basically live my life in such a way that I'm not gonna care about these things. Because the Bible also teaches us that we should look for the well-being of one another. And I think that's something that's important. And so just to give you a biblical sense of this a little bit, as we're thinking through these things, we're going to be talking about the freedom of the press here today. Let's look at, really quickly, Philippians chapter 4. And I'm not going to do an expositional teaching on this. I just want to read this to you and just kind of say a few words on what this means and how this can apply in some ways to what we're going to be talking about today with freedom of the press. Look at Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, and we'll read through verse 8. It says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentle spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Here we see a promise that we have in the Bible that we are to pray and that we are to make supplication. And I think it's fair to say that when we see the world that we live in today, where immorality has taken the front seat, has taken is sitting in the driver's seat, let's say, and, morality is somewhere in the trunk. And we're trying to figure out, wait a minute, what's going on? I would imagine that there are millions of Christians in this country that are praying for God to do something, to open the hearts of men and women. When I say men, I mean it in the broad sense here. But to open the hearts of men so that men could come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And I think there's also people that pray, I don't know if it's in the millions, but maybe it is, that would like for this country to at least go back to the fundamentals of our national birth, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, this kind of things, and that these kind of things don't get perverted as they have been perverted over time. And so one of the biggest things about our republic, it's the question that was asked, can we keep it? Can we keep it? And of course, this is something that when we go to God in prayer, we can also pray for this. In fact, when we do, I do a prayer list, me and my wife, we help out with our prayer list at the church. And one of the things that we always see there is how they're praying for the government and just for, our leaders in this country. And so this is a good thing, but you have to be informed as well. You have to know what you're praying for if you're praying for these things. And the last thing that I wanted to show you here was verse 8, where it says, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things." And so the Bible wants us to focus on those things that are righteous, those things that are good. And the idea of freedom of press, the idea of freedom of speech are good ideas. And they are ideas that are under attack in our country by a select group of people that have created an ideology and have proposed to us that this is the way that we should live. And the best way that I can describe it, and I've described it like this before, is the legalization of sin or of immoral behavior. Just a generation ago, we lived in a world where people didn't want to have the obscene and the immoral be so blatant in our culture. And now we live in a world where we're struggling to get books that promote sexual activities and things like transgenderism, homosexuality to children in schools. We're having a hard time pulling these things out and saying, well, this is not right, because there's so many people that are defending it, and they're so organized in their approach. And often for the Christian, it is easier for us to take our hands off and say, well, that's not my battle. Now, I say that with the full knowledge that there are people that are doing even more, way more than I can, or even, and I'm attempting to do, that this is something that I myself am trying to figure out on my end, and trying to push for just common sense legislation, let's say, common sense ideas of things that shouldn't be allowed in our society and in print and published in particular places. Again, this is not me saying that we shouldn't have any of those things anywhere, because again, if I take away the right of the demented mind to, want to write a children's book, let's say, and maybe I shouldn't say demented. I'm not trying to be offensive here, but I guess I'm being offensive in some ways. And unfortunately, we have to be offensive sometimes in our speech, because, when people are trying to promote their, what I would consider evil ideology on children, then I think that's certainly a place where you're allowed to offend someone. And so there are people that believe that writing these kinds of things are what they want to do. If I were to take their right of writing something like that, then they can easily turn around and take away my right to write a blog about it in the opposite, meaning arguing against it. And so we have to be very, very careful when we try to pin down people simply because on what we believe. You have to remember, God is not in the business of saving nations and countries. He saves individuals. And this is very true, even with Israel. He always had a remnant of individuals that he kept for himself. Meanwhile, the nation itself was going down the wrong path. And we see the demise of Israel in 70 AD when Jerusalem was completely destroyed. And it wasn't until in the 1940s with the Zionist movement that Israel was able to become a state again. But whatever Israel is today, obviously, it's not the same thing that it was then. And so this is not the saving of a country or a nation. I think people have to get that idea out of their mind. And because when you do that, you automatically turn into what I would call the communist way of thinking, which is, the community has to believe what I believe. Well, that's simply not true. When we get into our churches, when we get into these different kinds of things, there are more things that are censored. For example, in my church, we're not going to preach pro-homosexuality. That would be censored in my church. And rightly so, because in our church, we don't believe in that. And so we will not allow for that to be taught or preached in any capacity in our church. And so we still practice that sense of censorship. But what we won't do, or we shouldn't do, I guess we could do it, but what we shouldn't do is to enforce that on the general public. And this is something where I think the founders and the framers of the Constitution, the founding fathers, were very smart about doing. In some ways, and I don't know if this is true, this is just me thinking, I wonder if they thought something like, well, if we really want to spread the gospel and the ideas that we have, because there were Christians that believe in the gospel, obviously, among the founders and the framers. But generally speaking about them, they wanted ideas to flow freely. And they believed that men could then take these ideas that were being presented before them, sift through these ideas, and then may take demonstrable action. Action that would lead to whether it be legislation or a building of our culture and our society. But that has kind of flipped with the press right now. And we're going to get into the detail of this here in a second. Just trying I'm trying to help you understand biblically where I'm at with this in my mind. And I hope I'm making sense. But with the press, it has come to a point where it seems to be the thing that is actually promoting our culture and building our culture and shaping our culture. And I don't think that that is the intent of what the press should be. So let's get started with what we have here today. And again, this is me just thinking about these things. I want to recommend a book to you called A Free and Responsible Press. And it's by the Commission on Freedom of the Press. This came out of the University of Chicago, I believe, in the 40s. I never read this. I read it over the last few days. And it is a very good book to try to understand and wrap our minds around what people in the 40s, at least, were thinking about the press and what the role of the press was. And it was useful to me, and I wanted to recommend it to you because I think it would be useful. There's some ideas that I pulled from there for here. I also read other things from the founders and the other books that I have on this. I can't go through a full list on those right now because, one, I don't have that list in front of me, and I don't want to start messing up names. But I know that A Free and Responsible Press is a very good resource for you to kind of help you understand some of these things. And there's a lot of other things out there, but I just wanted to make sure I put that out there. So why is freedom of the press essential to political liberty? That's kind of the first question that we're going to try to tackle here today and think about. But first, we have to kind of talk about, what is the press, right? What do we mean when we're saying that, so that we're all on the same page here? Well, the press is an institution that is born, from a free society that has come together. That society has come together under what's called a social compact, and out of that, people coming together in this social compact, an institution is born from that, and that we call the press. Now, what does the press do? The institution, what it does, it issues information, and I want to use particular terminology here. It issues information, which includes news, so most of you guys think of the press as news, right? A press conference. You hear these kinds of words and you're like, oh, this is something that has to do with news. Now, news is a part of it. We'll discuss that here shortly, what other things are involved with that. But it is an institution that was born out of a free people, a free society that came together to form a social compact and is now the issuer of information through what we would call media being the plural form of the word medium. So this is a medium that we're using here. A plurality of it, we call media. That's what media is, And so it's the use of, by using media that reaches a mass audience. So the idea is, how do we talk to a lot of people? A very simple way of accomplishing this, for example, if, let's say, James Madison, who was one of the framers of the Constitution, said, I have an idea and I want more people to know about this idea. He can simply just state his idea at home and only a few people are going to hear him. Or he could write it down and he could get it published and he could disseminate that idea. So that's what media really is. And so we have to think about this. Now, when it comes to a free press, so that's what press is. When it comes to a free press, only a free country or free people can have what's called the free press. And particularly a people that believe in freedom of speech and protect the right of freedom of speech. So A despotic government, which is a despot, or a despotic government would be a government that's led by a singular person, a king, a prime minister, a president, something like that. But nobody else. There's no legislature. Like he decides everything, basically everything. He has the final authority on all things. He or she, I guess. And then there's what's called tyrannical government. Now, a despot could technically be a good leader, meaning that he can make decisions that are pretty good for the people if he is a kind-hearted individual, let's say. But normally, when you have a despot, you tend to have a tyrannical government. Now, a tyrannical government, technically speaking, can either have a despot that is a one-person government at the top, or it could just be an entire regime that has taken over. And, there's not a singular leader, but a plurality of leaders, let's say, or a legislature of a kind that really just turns tyrannical. Okay, and so these kind of countries do not have what we would call today a free press, okay, or freedom of the press. Now, I want to just quickly here, before I move forward, just read to you again the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Okay, and that I'm focusing today on that particular part of that amendment. So the press issues information, okay? And we can think about news. I want you to think about that too, because that's obviously a huge part of it. And what it's doing, it's providing knowledge to the world. It's providing a form of, you could even say, intelligence to the world about how the world is right now. Okay, it tells about other countries and other nations, and it tells you about events that have happened. Okay, back in, let's say 300 years ago, when people wanted to know what was going on in the world, they would have to crawl out from under the little rock, right, wherever they lived, and they would have to go out into the market square, and they would have to go there and just listen in to see what's going on. And maybe one person would be talking about, the economy, and this other person would be talking about agriculture, and this other person would be talking about just gossip, right? Because you get all kinds of things. And so whatever you would be interested in, you being the audience at this point, you would kind of go to wherever it is that you wanted to listen to and become a part of, let's say. And so that's what the press does. Okay. So if you can think about a small little town or a village, right, with the little square in the middle, and that's the market square, the village square there. And you can imagine people just kind of talking and an audience coming, and you had the people that had the information, they're relaying the information. Essentially, they're playing the part of the press. That's what the press would be. So I want you to think about that a little bit. Now, we used another word here, okay, because I said that the press issues information, including news, okay, through media. Now, what do we mean by the word media here? We've talked about it a little bit, but I want you to kind of think about media more than just news, okay? Because when you hear the word mainstream media, let's say, it kind of channels your thought in one direction. But really what media is things like the internet, okay? And the devices that make it, that make the internet available, obviously. So the reason that I say that is because if they lock down our phones, right, for example, and our computers, like they do in China, for example, and they don't let the internet in, if you want to think about it that way, then that is a restriction or a violation of freedom of the press. Okay, so we have to think about these things in our more technological world than, let's say, back in the day when they just had a simple press and a newspaper or something like that. So the internet, that's a big one, right? That's where the world goes to for their information. Then, of course, you have things like television, newspapers, magazines, radios, And then you have things like movies and books. So any media that you can think of where you're receiving information and the information is being put on there on purpose for the public to hear. That's what media is. Okay. So it's very, very broad. Okay. So when we're talking about freedom of the press, we're actually talking about all of these things put together. Okay. And so there's a freedom that has to exist, as our founding fathers understood this. There's a freedom that has to exist in whatever press media exists that is there to give information to a mass audience. Okay. So then we're talking about mass audience. Well, what is a mass audience? Well, the mass audience is not the public, okay? Because the public would assume all the people. Neither is it simply the citizens. The audience are the people that want to consume whatever it is that the press is issuing, okay? So think about it on a more practical level. Time Magazine issues an edition of their magazine, right? And you either, as the audience, you go consume it. That means you go purchase it, you buy it, you take it home, and hopefully you read it, right? Because what's the point of buying it and not reading it? You read through it, and now you have the same information that the people at Time Magazine have, that they've put it out there for the world to read. But maybe you might read Time Magazine, but you won't read Vogue. Now, Time Magazine, let's say in this example, can be read by citizens of America. It could be read by foreigners that are visiting here. It can probably even be shipped to a different country and somebody reads it somewhere else. So again, the idea of the audience and what the press talks to is not the people in the same sense that we've been talking about the people being free or people coming together. Now, why am I making this point? Because when politicians talk, for example, and when a lot of people in the news talk, they usually say, Americans are not interested in this, or Americans are. And if you're like me, you're sitting there like, wait a minute, I don't agree with that, and I'm an American. So what are you talking about? So no, the people that they're referring to on a technicality that do agree with them is the audience that purchases, that consumes the news, the information that they're putting out and takes it for themselves. Okay. So this is why you have Fox, right? You have conservatives that like listening to Fox and they consume that media and they agree with that. And so Fox can rightly say, our audience agrees with us. They can't rightly say Americans agree with us in that sense. And I think that this is something that has been used to make people think sometimes that the whole world thinks this way. Everybody thinks this is right. And so when you have someone espousing, let's say, these transgender books in children's libraries and schools, they could say, Americans are okay with this. Well, that's not true. Your audience that consumes what you put out is okay with that, but not everybody is. And so we have to really think about that. And then we have the press. Okay, so let's go talk again about the press a little bit here. The press as publisher, because that's what it does. The press publishes the ideas of the community at large. Okay, so I have an idea. I read an article about it. I pitch it to a newspaper. They say we like it, and they publish it. And then they use the means that they have, okay, to then push that through the different mediums or the media that they have. Okay, so the newspaper probably has a website. They probably have a blog. They probably have a subsidiary somewhere. They probably run a magazine. And so my article can now, potentially go out to all of these different places. And so the press is there to say, oh, okay, great. We're taking this information. We're putting it in the information highway, we're on the internet, whatever it might be, and we're going to let people consume it. And whoever consumes that becomes my audience. Okay. Now, I hope I'm not being too detailed here, because I find this fascinating. I find this really important because it helps me understand what am I talking about when I hear news, when I hear the press, when, all of these things. And so hopefully you're finding this comfortable, or that you like it, basically. I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so what are ideas? Okay, if the press publishes the ideas of the community, we have to understand what ideas are. Well, ideas essentially form our society. Okay, they form our society. Another controversial example, because why not use another one? Homosexuality before the 1950s, let's say, was essentially socially unacceptable. People knew it happened. People knew it existed because homosexuality has existed since the beginning of time, probably. But they understood, but they were like, no, we're not going to allow it into our society. They had their reasons for that, which I happen to have my own reasons why I think it shouldn't be a part of our social structure, but it is. Here we are. We have to deal with that. But that idea, right, once it got shifted, once people started thinking differently about homosexuality, and there's a number of things that happened there, which we talk about in one of our previous episodes, but there's a number of things that happen there that start shifting the thinking of certain people. There's certain self-interests that start to happen. And so now, 50 years later, or, more like 70 years later, you look back and you're like, wait a minute, this would have never been accepted. Now, what most people confuse that is that, since it's accepted now, it must be right. Well, you can make that argument for just about anything if that's the case. And so, if I get a chance, we'll talk about morality here if I ever get to the end of this. But that's what ideas are. Ideas do change your culture. They do change your society. Okay. If you stop, however, this flow of ideas, right? So if you only have one flow of idea going, but not all of them, okay, you're gonna have a problem. Okay. You're gonna spill over somewhere, and some things will get destroyed. Okay. The image I have in my head is of a dam, and a dam has, some dams are constructed in such a way that they have multiple outlets. Okay. And you can imagine that if these outlets were designed in such a way that they all have to function to let the water pressure out when they're turned on. And if only one was working, then it would compromise the dam in some sense. Then you can kind of have an idea of why we want the flow of ideas to keep going, whether you like them or not. We're not talking about here ideas that only you like, right? But ideas that whether you like it or not, you have to allow them to go out into the public. So the press is responsible to make sure that all ideas are moving forward, that they're being equally, let's say, distributed, meaning that there's no censorship of any kind happening. Okay, and this is a hard thing because, well, if we get a chance, we'll get into that. Let me skip in my flow so that I'm not messing up here. So here's the problem: you have hundreds of millions of people in the United States, and if millions of people are not able to get all of the flow of ideas that are coming through the different media, or should be coming through the different media outlets that we have, then all of a sudden you do away with freedom of speech. Now, you might be wondering, why is that the case? Why is it that if we get rid of freedom of the press, we also get rid of freedom of speech? It's because what freedom of press does, it promotes free speech. So if you stop this, you have to stop this. That's just how it works. There's no sense in telling someone, hey, you have a freedom of speech, but we can never publish what you have to say. But wait a minute. You have freedom of thought and freedom of speech. You just can't say it here. Or you can't say it there. Or you can't say it anywhere outside of your house, let's say. So the minute you lose freedom of the press, freedom of speech is going along with it. And so we have to understand that. Now, the question that I asked in the beginning is, why is freedom of the press essential to political liberty? Because political liberty, politics being the involvement in the affairs of your city and your town and your state and your country, that involvement requires speech, requires a flow of ideas, requires for you to speak what it is that you think should be done. And then the society can figure out, well, we're going to do that. We're not going to do that. That's a great idea. That's not such a great idea. So that's what we mean when political liberty is at stake. So if you're the kind of Christian that wants to censor at 100%, let's say, because again, we have to understand the ideas of censorship here. Okay. I don't think that a child should have access, or at least have readily access or quick access in their library at school, that a third grader, let's say, should have access to a book that's going to talk to them about things they don't even know how to compute yet in their head. Okay. It'll almost mess them up. Well, it will, not almost, it will mess them up. That's a form of censorship. And the thing is, people use the word censorship and they blow it up and they make it seem like, this Christian group or this Christian person or whoever it is trying to censor everything. Okay. But that's not the idea behind that kind of censorship in that sense. Okay. But the thing is, when people are getting involved in their government, they have to be able to freely speak as they would. And so if you take away the freedom of the press, you automatically take away the freedom of speech. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I got a little lost there. But so the press itself is integral, okay, to keeping the people rightly informed. Now, notice how we say that, rightly informed. So the press has a duty, a responsibility to do things in the right way. Now, most people say, well, we know the press doesn't do that. Well, you have to kind of, sometimes you have to go to Fox, then you have to go to CNN, then you have to go to this other site. And I use Fox and CNN because they're kind of the two big ones that people always talk about, to try to then figure out what the truth is, because you feel like the truth is somewhere in the middle there. I've read articles on CNN that I've agreed with, that I'm like, that's pretty on point, and I've read articles on Fox that I'm okay with. And I've read articles on both that I disagree with. So again, that's part of the press. It's supposed to put everything out there. But the question is that happening? Okay. Because one of the things that happens when people in the press hear this, we're supposed to inform the people. They hear that we're supposed to inform the audience, to sway the audience to believe what we happen to believe. And this is one of the biggest problems that we have right now in the media, with the press. Okay. If you ever listen to a press conference that happens at the White House, okay, and with the press secretary there, one of the things that you'll realize is that everybody's playing this little game. Everybody's trying to play gotcha. The person on the podium, which I don't know why you would ever take this job. Maybe there's a lot of money. I don't know. But you have to constantly be on the defense. You have to have notes prepped on everything. And you hardly ever can answer a question honestly. Because if you answer the question honestly, the person that's a member of the press is going to take that and is going to now slander you. They're going to present a fact of what you said, but they're not going to present that fact truthfully. And this happens on both sides, okay? this happens on the right side if you're conservative, on the left side if you're a liberal, right? Or if you're a leftist, let's say. Why would anyone answer honestly? Well, you would be political about everything. You would measure your words so carefully that you really say nothing. And so the only thing that's left at that point, I think, is sensationalism. Well, let's come up with the best headline that we could come up with, because that's probably all people are going to read anyways. And then they're going to go and they're going to make their, determinations from these headlines that they read. And so the more headlines and the more dramatic and the more interesting they are, the better it is. Okay. And this is dangerous, but that's happening in our country. So that the press, what they do then often is they take this to mean the fact that they have to inform people, because that's what their job is, that they have to spin it or craft it a certain way. Then the press, really what it's supposed to do, we're talking about the press as publisher here. What they're supposed to do is essentially publish just about everything they can get their hands on. Now, there should be obviously a quality to it. It's not just quantity, right? The idea of quantity is important in the press, because there's 300, almost 400 million people, I think, now in the United States. Who knows? Probably more with the immigrants. But there's a lot. There's hundreds of millions of people living in the United States. So you need a lot of information out there, right? You need a whole lot. Like if all we got was like a book, that would be bad. We're like passing along a book. Like, here, you should read this. You should try. It'd be bad. We have a lot of information. But what we tend to miss sometimes is the quality of that information. So we have the quantity, but we need to get the quality right. Okay. And so, but we have to understand that the press can only do so much. You, as the audience, as the consumer, you have to be able to really, sift through all this information that you're getting. Okay. So a lot of information is a good thing. It may be overwhelming sometimes, but it's actually a good thing because we have hundreds of millions of people. Okay, so it makes sense. Now, the press, because of everything that I've said, must be protected. If you don't protect the press, then you start losing freedom of speech, and that's a problem. Now, why do we protect the press? Why does it say that Congress can't have nothing against the press? And the clause there being the freedom of the press clause. Okay, that's what's called, what scholars would call that, I guess. Well, it's because the press, again, it promotes the ideas and free speech of the people in general to its audience. So here's what's interesting. If CNN or Fox, okay, either one of these, whoever you want to pick in your head, if they took information that they disagreed with, that they honestly and wholeheartedly disagreed with, but published it anyways, now their audience has a chance to read something from the perspective of the other side. But that often doesn't happen. What happens is that you have owners and editors that are chopping all the information down, getting rid of what they don't like, and then serving their audience essentially the nutritional value of mush. And so your quality, you might have quantity, but your quality is low. And you as a reader, you have to be able to understand when this is happening to you. As a consumer, you have to understand that this isn't good for me. I'm not getting all the information here. This has been watered down. And so there's a point to that. And I don't know if I have time to cover it all here, but let's keep trudging forward here. And so we have the free speech, the ideas that are being given, okay, these general ideas that are coming into the press, they're disseminating that to their audience. Remember what we talked about audience already. So in this process, what the press is doing is informing now the representative public, what's called the representative public, which is your citizens that happen to be reading this, but it's also educating others that don't know how we live. So when you are arguing, for example, if you read the Federalist Papers and you read the back and forth that was happening there, and you read it as a foreigner, let's say as someone who didn't know what America was all about, and you read it, you'd be very impressed. You'd be like, wow, these people are discussing ideas. These people have great points. These people have great points. And look, they're coming together and trying to understand these things. Well, what message do you get from America if you read America's news? Mudslinging, the Kardashians, whatever is entertaining, whatever is salacious, whatever is spectacular, but no substance. And so the press has a responsibility to take the information that it's generally getting and organize that information and be able to give it a meaningful, to make it meaningful. I should just say that, to make it meaningful. But they don't. They sell it to you. They sell the sizzle, let's say. But that's their responsibility. But they're not doing that right now, are they? I mean, it doesn't really take a genius to figure that out. If you just turn on the news, you would know that that's not happening. So the press has a lot of responsibility, don't they? It has a duty to the people. And it has a duty because what it's disseminating, what it's informing people of is the free speech that comes from the free thoughts that people have. And so any kind of censorship often that is broad and that is not based, let's say, on trying to protect the rights of others. This is why we have, laws against libel laws and that kind of thing. You can't just, lie about someone and discredit someone to the point that, they lose their business or something like that. You can't do that because you're infringing upon their rights of property, let's say, and different things like that. So, but while they have this duty to report all of this stuff, what they don't have a right, the press, they don't have a right to be right. So often the press, even in the highest kind of journalistic integrity companies that may be out there, even they sometimes get it wrong, or they don't get it all right, let's say. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that the press doesn't act as the collective expert. The press, the media, the news that you get, right? The movies, the books that you read, all of this information that's out there, the newspapers, magazines, they may have experts that work in these fields, but the press itself, the institution itself, is not a collective expert. And so what happens is when people think that's the case, or when the press presents itself, or the media presents itself as we're the purveyors of truth and facts and all of these things, well, you get what happened during COVID. You get lockdowns, you get restricted freedoms, you get people that get canceled and shut down. You get collusion between the government and huge social media companies like we saw with the Twitter files. You see things that it makes you go, wait a minute, that was happening behind closed doors. And so at no point is the press the expert. They will invariably get something wrong down the line, if not many things wrong. So what does it do? It issues the information. Again, they issue it. They give you the issue of their newspaper, of the magazine, of that episode. They issue the information. You, as the audience that's consuming it, you have to sift through it, and then you can make determinations from it. So one of the errors, for example, that we see is, and this has happened probably more so in the last at least 5 to 8 years that I've seen than ever before in my lifetime. Or maybe I just don't remember it. I don't know. But if you were to listen to mainstream media, let's say, you would come away with thinking, boy, in America, all those white cops like to kill as many black people as they can. That's the idea that's portrayed because of the way that the facts are told. In other words, facts are told, a white cop killed a black man, let's say. That's a fact, but it's not truthfully told. It says something like this. A white cop kills a black man. We have to stop this epidemic. Now, at that moment, there's a lie that snuck in there. The fact is not being truthful anymore. Okay? And so we have a problem with this because both sides play this little game. They'll take a fact, but they won't truthfully tell it to you. They won't meaningfully tell it to you. They won't tell you the full picture. They'll hold back something or a lot of things. And what does it do? It creates division. It creates strife. It's exactly what Satan would want. It's like a move out of his playbook. And the thing is, both sides do it. Both sides play this game. So right now, you look at the conservative media, they're going wild with Joe Biden's, mental health. Well, it's funny maybe to poke at that kind of stuff. If you find that funny and you find that interesting, it's certainly going to get you views. It's certainly going to, get people to subscribe. But that's not the issue. Because it's not like you've ever met someone who was old or someone who was not all there, or someone who slipped up every once in a while and made a mistake. But what is that matters about Joe Biden? Well, I would look at his policies. But that's not what we do. That's not what the press is doing. Some people might be doing that. But generally what you get in your feed on Twitter and your feed on YouTube and your feed on your email is the sensationalism of these things. And so we can't have a proper discussion. We can't sift through all this information properly if the information is badly organized and is of bad quality. So is that all the time I have? Okay. Oh boy. Where I want to go to from here. So the press, right, should not be engaged in telling the audience what it should or should not consume. So the right of the press is also the right of the consumer. The freedom of the press is also the freedom of the consumer. So what should be happening, for example, is Fox and CNN should distribute the news in the most honest, truthful way that they can without trying to censor the other side, because God forbid someone reads this, and let the audience then determine that. That's important. And we have to fix that in this country, because again, we lose freedom of the press, we're going to lose the freedom of speech. It's going to go, they're both going to go down the tubes here. Okay, I'm looking at my timer because I don't know if that's exactly how much time I have left. Do I have like 5 more minutes? Okay. So I'm gonna try to go for 5 more minutes here and try to cover the rest of what I have here for you guys. If not, what we can do is always go to I'm just reading one of the comments on a bunch of liars. Yeah, there's a lot of liars in the press. That's for sure. If what we'll probably do, we might just have to do a second part on this, to kind of just to try to get through everything. So I'll do what I can here in the next few minutes. So The press is not to be engaged in that kind of stuff, okay? The press, speaking of liars, does not have a right to lie, but it does have a right to expose lies. But the thing is, you don't need to expose lies and then try to go after the person and destroy them utterly. You expose the lie, and beyond the scope of a practical, let's say, and legal consequence, that should be it. But that's not what our press engages in most of the time. The press, and particularly you're seeing this a lot from the left to the right, you see this a lot, unfortunately, is this kind of running after people that they disagree with and censoring them and suing them and putting them in court and dragging them to jail if they can and making sure they have no advertisers. This is a big thing that's going on with GARM right now. But these are things that we have to pay attention to because they're all restrictive forms of the press. And you don't want that. Okay. Again, that means that you're going to hear things that you don't like, but you're better off wanting to hear the things that you don't like versus trying to get rid of some of those things, because eventually you'll have to do away with the entire thing. Okay. So something that we have to talk about as well would be that the audience, that's you have to be able to properly consume what the press issues, right? So again, that means that you have to be able to get all the proper information, okay? But if we have companies like Google or something like that are limiting what you can see on your phone based on some algorithm, then we have a problem. And Google, whether they want to admit it or not, is part of the press, is part of the media that goes out into the world. YouTube, all of these things, right? YouTube's part of Google. So we have to be able to understand that. But beyond the audience, okay, beyond the audience here, being able to read and comprehend the news, you have to be able to be willing to read and comprehend. That means sometimes you're going to have to go do some homework. Sometimes you're going to have to go and look for things that may not be there readily for you. And unfortunately, that I find myself all the time having to do that. I'll read an article, I'm like, ugh, and I have to like read between the lines and then go look for another article to finally find the committee that they're talking about and the report that they're referring to. It's very annoying, but it's part of what you have to do if you want to be fully informed. At the end of the day, there are some ways of communicating. For example, comments, like a comment section on YouTube or Twitter or something like that. Those can be helpful, but in the way that they are now, they don't really bother with bringing people together. And that's a big problem in the press, because the press has forgotten in many ways that they're supposed to have a relationship with their audience. And what they've done is they really are just trying to entertain the audience, and not inform the audience. And when they try to quote unquote inform the audience, they're trying to convince the audience. And that's not his job either. Okay. We're talking about pure information here, organized and distributed in a meaningful way. Okay. In a way that people could derive some sort of meaning out of it. I think that's important. So the people must have access to the publishing power of the press. This is another big one. I'll go through this one quickly. When the press is controlled by large, powerful corporations, right? We know this happens. CNN, Fox, right? And the big companies behind these companies. And there are not that many of them. Freedom of the press is at risk at that point. Why? Well, because CNN or Fox, let's say, or other popular big names, they're not the ones that have the only say in the matter. Okay? There's other outlets out there that should be able to speak freely, and we should allow them to speak freely. But here's the problem. The biggest problem is that when a media outlet comes under the pressure of its boss, of an owner, then you have a problem. Because what you're going to get is badly organized news or information, factually erroneous or not told in a truthful manner, like we talked about earlier. Or you're going to get censored information, right? If I own a publishing company, and and, my best friend is a millionaire who's investing in my business, and he just so happens to be pro-abortion, you think I'm going to let stuff on my platform that is going to be, speaking against abortion? Probably not, Or if I have any integrity, I would say, well, no, then stop giving me the money. And then now I might have to risk shutting the whole operation down. And so there's a problem. We have to understand that large corporations are behind this, and there's a lot of pressure. But the journalists, the people, right? Because at the end of the day, the press is not just an institution that has no people in it. It's made up of people and free people. And free people need to learn how to stand up when they're being told to censor. And this is what's mind-boggling about Twitter and the Twitter files and what came out of that. If you're informed on that, you would know that, or you would ask, what I'm asking at least is, how on earth that people just refuse to do it? Well, it's my paycheck. Well, screw the paycheck at that point. If your paycheck dictates your morality, you have a problem. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of our press is. Morality goes out the window so that they can get that check. And that's all the time I got, right? Okay. So we're going to have to cut it short here, guys. We'll try to jump back on next week and maybe finish some of these thoughts and move on to maybe the Second Amendment or talk about something else on the First Amendment. I'm not sure yet, 100%. I always do this to myself. I kind of have a hard stop here because we are streaming and we're only allowed to go so long. So sorry about that. But Mind of Miz Podcast, thank you so much for watching. If you want to subscribe, go to mindofmiz.com and you can subscribe there. Thank you.